Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner podcast, where I talk to treasurers each and every week about their treasury careers, how they started their careers, where they are now, where they see both themselves and the treasury profession going to next. But this is one of our revisited episodes. You're going to hear me in a moment having a lovely conversation with Fred Schacknies. When I originally spoke to Fred, way back when, back in beginning of COVID, really, he was at Hilton, and we'll talk about his career there. But actually, I then catch up at the end of the show with Fred. Now he's with Technip, and he can tell you all about them as a company, talks about some of his experiences within Treasury. He's a great guest. Let's get on with the show.
In this week's show, I'm joined by Fred Schacknies, the Senior VP and Treasurer at Hilton Worldwide. Headquartered in Virginia, Hilton Worldwide, as many of you will already know, are an American multinational hospitality group. In 2018, they were recognized as one of the best workplaces to work in. And in recent years, they've moved back from, well, they've been both a public, a private, and more recently a public company again, which I'll ask Fred to perhaps explain a little bit more detail in the show. But as you Treasury guys love your facts and figures, I just wanted to highlight a couple of their numbers because I think they're truly amazing. So Hilton Group have 16 world-class brands, 5,500 properties, 895 rooms, 109 countries and territories. Get your head around that lot. And they've, in their 100-year history, welcomed more than 3 billion guests. And I've been one in the past and been very happy. Sometimes on the podcast, I give a detailed introduction to our guests. But rather than that today, what I want to do was get Fred to tell us about himself rather than me ruin it for all you guys. Kicking off into it, Fred, you've got a degree from Brown and an MBA from New York. Maybe talk us through your first moves into the world of corporate treasury and how you started out, if you would.
Sure thing. Thanks, Mike, very much for the opportunity, and glad to be joining you today. After college, I started out actually on a trading desk, somewhat through happenstance. I knew coming out of college that I kind of wanted to focus on economics. That was my degree. And the reason being I was just sort of quantitatively oriented, but I think what I found interesting about economics was it's something that kind of had a social impact to it as well. I mean, it's really just as much about psychology as it is about math. Mm-hmm. So coming out with that economics background, I kind of decided to go into finance and stumbled into treasury really by way of a trading desk. Not that I saw myself as a trader per se, but that's where an interesting opportunity came up. And so the first 5 years I spent trading currencies and interest rates and doing sales as well. Having done that, and that was a fantastic and fascinating place to spend a couple of years, but I didn't really have any particular idea of what happened, what transpired in that value chain that I was on before me or really after me. And as fascinating as those kind of microseconds are, when between bids and asks and price changes, I wanted to get a kind of a bigger picture of a better understanding of what was going on in the entirety of the finance value chain. So I decided to go back, get an MBA, and then from that went into the corporate practitioner world. And that's something I'd kind of gotten a glimpse of, having spent some time in corporate sales desks as well, speaking with corporate treasurers and understanding about their perspectives, the problems that they faced, and really how it fit in with the bigger picture of the issues that their companies were dealing with. Having gone through, having got my MBA, worked then for 3 companies. The first one was Lucent Technologies, or what was then Lucent Technologies, based in New Jersey. After that, with what was then Constellation Energy, based in Baltimore. And now for the last 10 years or so, have been with Hilton here in Virginia.
And with those roles at Lucent, that was your sort of introduction to Treasury, if you like. You came into it, so you focused on sort of in-house banking of things, or how did your Treasury career grow? Because you're the global treasurer of Hilton, so you got it done pretty well through those years.
Yeah, it was an interesting transition to go from a trading desk with a mindset of a trader and into that of a corporate treasury practitioner. And obviously you've got to shift your objectives, your framework, your risk perception, everything else that you look at. So, the problems that Lucent was dealing with at the time, being a growing global multinational company at the time, lots of issues with global liquidity, with global risk. And those are the kind of things that somebody, who works on a trading desk probably has a good sense of. Most of the issues that I focused on when I was at Lucent had to do with dealing with kind of global growth and the financial consequences of that. So in-house banking, yes, was definitely one of the big successes there, by implementing a very successful in-house bank platform in terms of what it was able to achieve, but also in terms of how it did it in terms of technology and process and everything else. It really did have some positive financial impacts for the company in terms of ability to repatriate cash, in terms of ability to get our arms around risk. And so, lots of good lessons learned there about, I think, things that companies should look at with rolling out that type of platform.
And from technology and telecoms, you then made a move into America's energy choice, Constellation, or explain those guys. And it was a move of location as well. And
it was, and partially based on the fact that I'm from the Baltimore area originally, and my family was nearby there. And this move happened shortly after our first two children, we have twins, were born. So the idea of being closer to family sort of grew in significance in terms of career choice. So an interesting, change in terms of not just location, but industry, everything kind of from the utility management side to longer term projects of nuclear power, plant generation, and to the kind of the day-to-day volatility of trading activity. So, had an interesting portfolio with treasury challenges, let's say.
So what then happened with Constellation as they evolved or changed? What happened with the group?
So the company, very successful in lots of different activities, ultimately was acquired by Exelon. And it just so happened that around the same time that transition was going on, Hilton was relocating from Beverly Hills to Northern Virginia. So an opportunity came up at Hilton that I think was just, too good to pass up. Kind of going back to, so my roots and interests really lie with international, with global enterprise and the challenges of international finance. And Hilton having, as you mentioned earlier, a really profound global footprint, which is really absolutely fundamental to who we are. That was an exciting opportunity. I myself was one of those 3 billion folks that you kindly pointed out at the beginning. And so it's just kind of one of those brands that, a majority of people have a very positive affiliation with, and myself included. And having traveled quite a bit myself, as I have, the idea of being part of an institution that sort of fosters international travel was certainly attractive in and of itself.
You joined Hilton back in 2009. Where was it in its journey, if you like, because you've been there, over 9 years now, and throughout that time, it's changed a lot as a company. Treasury to one side, we'll dig down into that, but how was it different?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I joined immediately after the relocation from California to Virginia, right. Which came shortly after the company was acquired by Blackstone, right. And was taken private. A number of profound changes there in terms of leadership, the ownership, in terms of kind of the entire corporate leadership team. But the timing of that, ill-fated though it was in the downturn of kind of 2008 and 9, it was that was a rocky time for a lot of companies, and Hilton included. And so lessons that I had learned in terms of managing liquidity in dire straits at two companies prior certainly came into play as well. And, I think though that, Hilton has a very strong franchise, very strong brand, and withstood all the cash flow tests during that period very soundly, and has really solidly rebounded since then.
So as you went through that downturn and recovered, the company changed as well. You went back to public, and there were a couple of different changes. How did that change and affect you guys in Treasury and your role, and what happened?
Yeah, so it definitely is an interesting transition point. The company being private for a number of years was an essential phase in its development, I think. A number of changes had to happen in terms of not just the physical location of the company, but in terms of the makeup of the organization, in terms of refreshing a number of the brands, in terms of integrating a number of the corporate activities, and really just revitalizing the entire corporate enterprise. And I think those types of decisions, many of which are very expensive and many of which are very painful, are often, I think, best executed under the umbrella of a private institution. And I think that's a lot of those changes are what Hilton was able to make. And I think in the years that followed, I think the leadership team has done a fantastic job of exactly that, of really revitalizing the corporate enterprise and the franchise. So from that, the company, I think, has rebounded very successfully in terms of sponsoring organic growth, not just of net units of hotel rooms and hotels, but also in terms of brands. All of that obviously was being done by a PE investor, was done with the expectation of eventually returning to the public markets.
Right.
And so that was done in 2013. The company went through its actually second IPO, the first one being a couple decades earlier.
Yeah.
So that transition back into the public world, I think by that point, I would say it really wasn't that tremendous of a change, because by the time we'd gotten into the tail end of this ownership phase, many of the corporate controls that you would normally associate with public life, were already in place. Many of the disciplines in terms of management structures were already in place. There was a bit of a transition in terms of our main owner being from sort of the, sole to majority to minority to now, entirely disinvested. There was some change there in terms of who reports what to whom. But really, in terms of the all of the installation and the growth of the kind of the corporate engine behind it all, I think was already in place.
And with that, throughout the time that you've been there in the 9.5 years, a global multinational, you've led teams, the US and UK and overseas, and different integrations with Treasury globally. What's it been like for you leading a global Treasury team? What's your leadership style for those guys? Are you hopping on a call every week, or how do you spin the plates for each of the different locations, as it were?
When I got to Hilton 9 years ago, I was actually the only person on my team here in the head office, and everyone else was either in one of our hubs in Memphis or outside of London. And so I had literally no connection to them other than telephone and email, and whatever data they were able to share in whatever format. And to answer that question about how does one lead a global team, it's putting in place a stool of people, process, and technology. And that, has to span globally, for all of those things to come together. In terms of the technology, which was a large piece of focus for several years, it was just getting all of the different offices on the same technology platform. Without that, it's impossible to share data, much less intelligence. So that was a key focus for really the first 5 years, I think, of being here. But along with that is aligning process and making sure that everybody's working under the same set of policies and according to the same standards and according to the same goals. The last piece there of people is the hardest one to realign, and it's the most important. You can't do that without a certain amount of face-to-face. And I do travel to try to get in front of the other teams, maybe not as much as I could.
As much as you can.
As much as one can. It's putting other people in front of their faces too. So we're trying to be more mindful about building connections, not just at my level, but up and down the organization. Getting people to the point where, even if you're in a different location or a different continent or a different time zone, it's knowing what your colleagues are doing so that if you call them up, where they are in their day and their workflow. Everybody's essentially working as part of the same team, even if they're not co-located. And again, getting to that level of sort of people alignment, you can't do it without process, and you can't do that without technology.
And Fred, you talked there about all pointing in one direction, everyone processes everything. But how did you come up with those goals? What's the ethos for the Treasury team at Hilton Worldwide?
So that's a great question. I think, aligning everybody around the same purpose, around the same goals, really does start top down. And I think, to give credit where due, I think Hilton and the leadership here have done a tremendously good job at defining that at the corporate level and pushing it out. And so our vision, mission, and values is all very clear. We all know that whether we're working in one side of Treasury or the other, or accounting or anything else, it's all going to the same goal as a hospitality company. But, pushing that down more tangibly into what does that mean for finance? What does that mean for Treasury? All derives from top-down mission statements. And, for my role, it's up to me to sort of take what's given to me at the, from CFO level down, and articulate that to my team, and pull them behind a common purpose, and we say, this is why we do what we do. We don't do it to manage cash. We don't do it to trade currencies. We do it to make sure that, our goal, which is to fill the earth with the light and warmth of hospitality, is something that we can continue to fulfill. And so, obviously then that all sounds very good, but then it comes down to some tactical matters of treasury management. It's, aligning everybody around a common set of goals and a purpose and making sure that everybody knows, how what they do every day fits into those common purposes. And so, from kind of corporate to finance to treasury, and it parcels out into, there's matters of cash management and operations, there's matters of banking, there's matters of financial risk, there's matters of liquidity. Everybody hopefully understands how what they do ties into the goal above them and the goal above that.
When people actually look through your profile, perhaps on LinkedIn, and look there, you guys have won some awards. Now, what have those been? You got a Pinnacle Award through the AFP, Alexander Hamilton. What have those been for? Not just saying, oh, we did this project, thanks very much, but how did it come about, or what? Give us some examples there.
The first of the three chronologically was the Pinnacle Award, the Grand Prize from a couple of years back. That was related to work we had done on cash flow forecasting, which really was kind of a byproduct, or was in reaction to the company's transition from private to public and with the IPO. And so it was in response to some changes in how we had to manage cash. And so to react to your question earlier about, what did it mean to transition out, I guess at a more tactical level, there were some other reactions. And so, the cash flow forecasting requirements of a public company versus a private one, it sounds simple. It's a large event, and as you can imagine, for a company of our size, and it's something that you can throw loads and loads of bodies at, but there's better ways of doing it, and that's kind of the gist of what we did. Was really just kind of building a better mousetrap when it came to forecasting methodology. It was, I guess the secret sauce of it was taking that data that was available, which is not always perfect, and making the best use of it by kind of just applying some statistical overlays and some kind of rational conclusions to sort of normalize and to kind of build a forecast where imperfect data was, or where the data wasn't perfect, I guess.
Yeah. And you actually got a result that was actually meaningful, sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's, we got from that, there was for that point of our transition, we got a process that was really, by all accounts, kind of, FTE-wise more efficient and still providing a great output in terms of intelligence.
And then a couple of the other projects, again, is that the evolution of Treasury you've seen it through, or what's been happening?
Yeah, and so the other two projects, I'll sort of respond to them together. One was related to global liquidity, and one was related to global risk. And to be fair, they kind of go hand in hand. Each one of them was sort of a large and multi-year project by itself. But collectively, they speak to sort of Hilton's ongoing growth overseas. And as you kindly noted earlier, we're in 109 countries and territories now and continuing to grow. And, harking back to earlier days of my own career at Lucent, not dissimilar challenges of any company that exists and is growing in many places around the world, presents loads of challenges in terms of managing liquidity efficiently, avoiding trapped cash, getting it back in a way that's, friendly from a perspective of tax and accounting and treasury. And so, the cross-currency aspects of that were challenges that we needed to get a better handle on. The kind of the liquidity visibility aspects of that we need to get a better handle on. And, each of those was a multi-year project in its own right, and grateful and thankful that for getting a little recognition for each of those. Each one of those is obviously a team effort, and it was good to draw some attention to the work that many members on the team had been doing. And
that team, how are you structured, and, what would you say has been key to the success of that team? What's your ethos? And
our team is organized with we've got a regional treasury organization that sits in 3 locations and looks after cash and banking and is really the sort of liaison to the operational finance world on all matters relating to treasury. And then we have 2 corporate-based teams, one that's sort of aligned to kind of front office responsibilities and really looks after the managing of risk and liquidity. Mm-hmm. And another, essentially a middle office team that looks after the systems, process controls, and data that flows in and out. In terms of central ethos of building that team has been I think striking a balance in terms of diversity of skill set, of background, of mindset, of personalities. And, I think we do have a good, healthy diversity on all of those fronts. And, if anybody on the same expertise, you wouldn't really get a lot done and you wouldn't grow very much,
Yeah.
and part of that, the benefit of that diversity is just bringing lots of different viewpoints, and often healthy disagreements on things, which is something that I absolutely value, in my own team. Having open debates on topics and coming to a better outcome than you would if everybody just said, "Yes, boss, that sounds great."
Yeah, that's how we do it. When you talk about diversity, widening that sort of definition, we've looked at the Women in Treasury. I did a Women in Treasury month. Actually, was very successful. It was quite an interesting one because there were a couple of my guests who, and these were ladies, and they said, well, actually, it doesn't matter, Mike. It's about, not just gender. It's about equality with, looking at disabled people, looking at different people coming from different ethnic backgrounds. It's a much wider issue, and that's what they were definitely supporting. But you say about the diversity and the different makeup of the background. How do you try and encourage that, or what's your sort of, thoughts around that?
In my own career experience, I've had the unique opportunity to experience diversity and the lack thereof on a couple of fronts. The first 5 years of my career, I was working in Saudi Arabia and on an entirely male company. Thankfully, after that, every other organization I've worked in has been roughly 50% female, and kind of within the Treasury domain, sometimes even more than that.
Yeah.
And so, I will say, having experienced one extreme there, and then, I definitely favor the kind of diversity of gender as well as other dimensions of opinion. Have also worked overseas. Have worked with a number of folks from really all parts of different worlds. And, I can say firsthand, I do very much favor diversity in terms of not just ethnic or national or cultural. There's lots of different factors there that influence how people think about things and address them. And I do very much favor, diversity on that front as well. But even besides that, there's people who, some are more sort of, organized than others, conceptual than others. Some are more fast or slow thinkers. Some are more introverts or extroverts. I think each one of those dimensions influences how somebody views a problem. Fundamentally, that's what any of us are trying to do, is just deal with the problems, be they kind of short-term or long-term. Having that breadth of background and experience, I think ultimately makes you better problem solvers as a team.
And when you're, taking that the further on step, when you're recruiting, what are you looking for in terms of those people?
Yeah, I think, anybody who walks in the door looking for a job in Treasury is almost certainly someone who's, at least sort of quantitatively minded, hopefully kind of logic minded as well. And I think that applies for anybody who's looking for a finance job in general. I think for what I find interesting and what's kept me in Treasury for all of my career has been, the unique characteristic of, I think, everything we do in Treasury just having this profound immediacy. Yeah. Everything has a kind of a real, tangible, immediate impact, and short time frames and imperfect information, often and usually with, material impact. That type of thought process, I think, takes a certain type of personality to it. Someone who, I think there's a level of maturity and confidence, but I think also a level of even risk tolerance. I think, which is sort of, you don't hear treasurers talking about the benefits of risk tolerance too often. But the reality is that everything we do, recommending a decision on something or making a decision on something, everything we do is we're taking some risk on, because nothing that we react to has perfect information in. My framework coming from a trading desk, that's what trading is. It's making time-crunched decisions with material impact based on imperfect information.
How has world of Treasury changed, would you say, and where do you see it going next?
I think everything I described there, I think, is what makes for a thoughtful Treasury practitioner. But the special ingredient, the one that makes a perfect candidate, I think, is the ability to communicate and to interact and to manage people, whether it's up, down, or sideways, and, to demonstrate leadership potential. Put that in the context of, I think, where Treasury is coming from and going to. In the end, all we're doing is not even managing money. We're managing information for the most part. We have to appreciate the fact that the role of capital and technology relative to the role of labor will continue to shift in our industry just like every other. Some of the advice that I've given to folks is say, assume that at some point during your career, you will be partially, if not fully automated out of a job. That may or may not happen, but I think it's a good assumption to make because all of us, whether it's in treasury, whether we're managing cash or risk or we're at the treasurer level or anything else, I mean, we're all just basically human algorithms. Some of us a little fuzzier than others. But when you think about think about your job as you would describe it to a software engineer, hopefully you'll be in a better position down the road to continue to be one of those folks that's kind of solving problems.
When you said that, I've had a number of these conversations, obviously, and I spoke to Mark, actually, just this week's episode has just come out from Johnson Controls, and he talked, number one, about communication skills. He started very similarly, actually, in more of a sales role before he kicked off his career in earnest with Johnson Controls. But he said those communication skills that he learned in that sales role really helped him, and that's one of the things he sees from his team. But then we also moved into the technology space or talking about that. And one of the things we sort of, and I've talked with a couple of other people, is it seems that the pyramid of Treasury, if you like, has, it used to be this, big wide triangle, but now it's got narrower, and there are still those there are still roles in Treasury. People aren't going to be automated completely out of jobs. But instead of having two more junior people just doing a more junior turn the handle type job, actually you're going to need one more senior person, not senior, but an operational type person who will supervise, make sure that everything works. So there's still a need. It's more the thought, strategic problem solving, which sounds like you're seeing as well.
Yeah, and to the point about communication. You can't be effective in that role of not only problem solving, but then articulating the problem to, everybody you're working with without those communication skills. So I think, it's absolutely key to the success for anybody in that role.
Okay. And then looking back at you and your history, if you like, what would you put down as some of your success factors? You're the treasurer of Hilton Worldwide. What would you put it down to?
I'll expand it a little bit beyond myself to the success of others I've observed as well in the course of my career. And at one level, it comes down to finding the problems that need solving. Having worked in 4 different companies and 4 different industries, on the one hand, kind of every company feels that they're unique, and each one of them is unique in their own mind, I'm sure. In the end, the treasury issues that span across them are more similar than they are dissimilar. But the context different for each company. The prioritizations are different for each company. So, I would say as a matter of career success, make sure you're bringing the right tool to the right job in terms of figuring out what problems are most prioritized for the company that you're part of. But beyond that, other bits of career advice I would pass on is to try to get the broadest career path you can. I myself, for one reason or another, have been fairly specialized in what I've done. I think, frankly, if I could go back, I'd like to have experienced a broader selection of different functions on my way up that ladder, and so that's something I would encourage others to do too, is experience different ways of thinking, different types of problems and experience working with different types of people too. Tying all those things together, though, the ability to manage people up, down, and sideways and the ability to communicate is absolutely fundamental, I think, to anyone's success.
Amazing. Well, I think it was we wrap up today's show, and Fred said it was going to be okay. We'll put it in the show notes, his LinkedIn link, so you can perhaps connect with him if it's appropriate and everything else. You've obviously given back through the AFP. You're on the board there and everything else, and looking, just to wrap up today's show, what advice are you going to give to, one of those guys who says, right, actually, I want to be the treasurer of Hilton, or I want to be involved in the AFP, or want to emulate yourself? Any other things that you'd say?
Yeah, I think getting involved is key, and I think that applies to probably any role in any type of industry. I think having spent my career in Treasury, on the one hand, I would say it's a perfectly good place to spend your career. On the other hand, I'd be disingenuous if I didn't say that there aren't great opportunities to do things elsewhere too, because I've not experienced any of them. But joking aside, spending your career in Treasury, I mean, it's obviously great for folks who are particularly quantitatively oriented, particularly logic oriented. As I said, I think the ability to kind of be able to take confident risks based on imperfect information and to deal in the immediacy of the now, I think are also characteristics that, if that sort of appeals to you, then Treasury is a great place to spend your career. Don't underestimate kind of the importance of people and dealing with people is about communication. And whether your career is in Treasury or takes you anywhere else, I think those lessons will apply no matter where you are.
A great summary, I think, from Fred. Thank you very much for your time today. As I said before, if you want to connect with Fred, feel free. Look at his LinkedIn link. I look forward to my next stay at Hilton.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mike, for the opportunity. And we're looking forward to having you.
Great stuff.
So I hope you enjoyed that podcast. When we last caught up with Fred, he was at Hilton. Now, Fred Schacknie has actually moved on. He is now the VP and Treasurer at TechnipFMC. They are a UK-based provider of technology solutions to the traditional and new energy industry. But they're actually headquartered over in Houston, Texas. Proprietary technology, comprehensive solutions, all that other stuff. I'm going to let Fred explain that in just a moment. Fred, can you bring us up to date? When we spoke, you were at Hilton. Now you've made this move. What was that transition like? And then we'll talk about this new company and things. Talk us through. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and happy to be back and have the opportunity to chat. It certainly has been a interesting, a fascinating transition for me. I've had the opportunity to work in a number of different companies, different industries, all in my Treasury career. TechnipFMC, vastly different in a lot of respects from Hilton in terms of the business and the financial needs, but fundamentally the same Treasury principles apply as they have for every other Treasury role I've ever had. So TechnipFMC, just a quick word, what we do is provide the equipment and the services to the energy industry, traditional energy industry, but also new energies. And so we manufacture extraordinarily engineered devices that make it possible for energy companies to produce energy. A lot of that is the hardware that sits on the seafloor, the umbilicals, the pipes that connect it, all of which makes our modern economy function with the energy that it requires. So it's an incredibly interesting and challenging environment that we work in as a company, which how leads to a comparison. Is it also challenging and interesting for Treasury? It is, yes. So we operate in 41 countries. That's about 6.7 billion of revenue last year, and very diverse organizationally in a lot of respect, not least of which is people, and which is one of the most fantastic and fascinating aspects of the job is incredibly diverse group of people from the top to the bottom. So operating in 41 countries, the company itself is a merger of a US company, FMC, and a French company, Technip, each of which was in their own right very internationally diverse before they joined.
And what does that, and how does that then, what's that like in Treasury terms? What's that like for the Treasury team and everything?
So it's my Treasury team, which is about 60 people, which is not small for Treasury for a $7 billion company, is sitting in 12 countries today. And even in each of those countries sits in sometimes more than one city, which is just a byproduct of the way the company has grown, not just from this merger, but from other companies that have been absorbed along the way. And they're there for good reason. We have physical footprint in a lot of locations because we manufacture stuff. And that creates challenges in our, thankfully in our modern workplace environment where we're all largely on teams. It helps equalize, it helps bridge communication gaps around the world, but it does have that sort of natural fragmentation going on, which is a cultural headwind. Difficult to gather everybody together for any one thing at any one time. And that really has been one of the challenges that I've sought to address in the 2.5 years or so that I've been with the company so far, which is kind of establishing a singularity of culture.
And how have you done that? What's been the weather vane, or what's been the guide for you?
Yeah. So really it's just a question of that there's an aspect of identity, which is to say we're one company. And I mentioned the merger that took place, several years ago now, but not that long ago. We also went through a divestiture, a spinoff of one of 3 business units, which was called Technip Energies, which was a particular segment of the chain. What remains is largely the production of equipment and services, subsea as well as surface. So there was a merger of organizations as well as a spinoff of organization as well, which creates a lot of friction and in terms of identity. But beyond just branding, beyond just setting a vision for, hey, we're one team now, is establishing singularity of purpose. What is it? What are our objectives for treasury and for finance and for the company? We went through some very foundational changes, very transformative changes as a company. And in response to that, the needs of the finance organization and the treasury have to change too.
And when you say that, what do you mean by that? It's sort of, without going into confidential company information, it's more, how did you align yourselves? And I know that there were things with different cash cycles or different things with the business and everything else, but again, tell us more, because it's.
Yeah. So I joined the company in December of 2020, just ahead of the spinoff, which occurred in February of 2021. My mandate coming in as treasurer for effectively the RemainCo was three things, really. It was help execute the spinoff with all the complexities that has. But then beyond that was two things. It was, I would say, fixing the balance sheet and rebuilding the treasury organization. So fixing the balance sheet, and this is all public information, prior to the spinoff, the company had a net cash position of $1 billion, $4 billion of debt, $5 billion of cash. Not an uncomfortable position to be in for a lot of companies.
Yeah.
After the spinoff, that flipped. We went to having a net debt position. And so that was a big change for a lot of companies. For most of the people that worked for both companies had only ever worked in a company with a net cash position. And when you're in a net cash position, and I want to say your priorities are different. You don't have to be as laser focused on the timing, the velocity of cash flow, tracking where every dollar is at every moment of the day. When you're in a net debt position, and by the way, we also were downgraded from investment grade to high yield in conjunction with that for understandable reasons. Our focus changed quite dramatically as a company, where the focus on cash flow and the focus on the cost and capacity of credit were now new points of concern or focus that simply weren't there before. And that was a change. It's not just treasury change, but finance in general.
Yeah.
And so the way you do that is it really required partnership with my colleagues in the finance organization in reprioritizing, in drawing awareness, understanding from the leadership of the company and the business leaders of the company, to appreciating what do we do now to pivot, to drive a cash flow mentality and a mentality that finance and all the dimensions of currency and credit and cash flow and capital, all of these things have a capacity and a cost. There's a lot of C's in sequence, but they all have considerations that now need to be part of our equation, which, by the way, it sounds like, well, shouldn't they always have been? And the answer is yes, frankly. But again, for a lot of companies that are in a position either of an abundance of cash and liquidity or capital, it's easy to deprioritize. So it's a question of reprioritizing the company, the leadership and the business and the finance team to support that.
And I'll share with listeners and also share with future podcast guests. Fred gave me the best set of notes I've ever had in my life for this podcast. So I thought that they were great notes, and I was like, but actually I'm going to take one of these. And you talked here about shifting your mindset from legacy policies, decentralized organization and things, but I'm going to dig into that slightly different angle. You had, as you said, established teams that were, I was asked last year's Eurofinance, someone said, how come you've managed to do 280 podcasts and all, I thought I'd do 10, 280 later. And I said, look, every treasurer within 10 feet of me, I've got 10 different treasurers, right? And they were like, oh yeah. I said, well, they're cash rich, they're debt laden, they're centralized, they're decentralized, they're this, they're that. And they were like, oh, right. I said, all of these, although they all have the same title, treasurer, they all do it differently. Mm-hmm. Going through that at a company. So you were having that shift of mindset. Now you had a team that had been used to, we got the cash, it's coming in, no problem at all. As you say, laser focus, and you get them, but you've obviously got legacy employees. And again, that's quite a shift in itself. How did you go about that? Was it just sit down, have a coffee? Look, guys, now we've got no money. We've got to do this. We've got to make sure the money's not just rolling in. We've got to do this. How did you help those guys pivot Again, it's for the listeners, because might be in a similar situation. There'll be another treasurer now listening going, I want this advice. So how do you
No, I don't want to belittle my own response here, but you just nailed it. Basically, sitting down with people, the only thing that changes is whether or not you're physically in proximity to have that cup of coffee together or via Zoom. But yeah, it is about sitting down with people one-on-one in groups. It's all about communication. And communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to start with a vision. So it means starting with setting goals and priorities. So as a company, newly high yield with a very different balance sheet than what we've managed before. And by the way, without the tools that a company with such balance sheet would typically want and expect to manage cash efficiently, it is sitting down with senior leaders as well as people operating cash positions and everybody in between to say exactly that. Hey, we're in a very different reality now. We have new and different priorities. We have a path forward, by the way. We know how to get to where we need to get to. And here are the goals we're setting out: leverage, liquidity. Here's why those goals are important to us, because they impact stakeholders' perceptions of our company, which then impacts our own cost of credit and capacity and everything else, which makes us more competitive commercially. And so once you lay out why those goals matter and what our plan is to address them, it's not a difficult conversation, to be honest. Really, then it just becomes a question of, once everybody gets it intellectually, says, okay, new set of rules, new goals, there is, to be fair, always going to be an amount of just organizational inertia that for somebody who's done something a certain way for a certain number of years, yeah, of course, it's always difficult to pivot. And that's where a lot of just sort of hand holding or on the job training or getting into the trenches, and a lot of going to the Gemba is one of the phrases here, and that level of connection of attaching sort of what's the high level purpose and goals we're trying to achieve, and how does that tie down to all the myriad tasks that everybody is doing on a daily basis, is the only way you can make that effective. And there's plenty of examples of those. When you think about something like managing debt, well, if your cash is all over the world, it makes it much harder to pay back debt in a timely way. Yeah. So you got to concentrate cash. Well, that's pretty simple stuff. That's nuts and bolts for Treasury, but yet it's still nuts and bolts. Like, you got to do it. You have to assemble that machine and make it run well. And so that means understanding how many different cash operators in many countries do their jobs. And usually there's similarities, but there's a lot of circumstantial differences too. So it's tying to something as, I don't want to say as mundane, but something as operationally focused as setting cash positions in a certain way, in a certain bank account, in a certain country. All of that times hundreds drives our ability as a company overall to pay back debt in a timely way. So it's all about kind of attaching tasks to enterprise level goals.
And stepping back from that, you were joining, as you say, prior to this big shift in the company. So you were a fresh face as well. Yeah. And again, you put in some of your notes here about this treasury transformation with people, policy, and different things here. But also then you were learning a new company, comes a lot of spinning plates just intellectually as much as anything. What was that like for you on a personal level as a treasurer? Obviously, sometimes I know that when I did things with the podcast, I felt like a bit like that Harry Potter thing with things being dragged out your brain sort of thing. And you said after some of the podcasts or some of the sessions I've done with my US clients, I go to bed and I'm just absolutely exhausted because it's great. It's intellectually stimulating. But for you going through all that change, what was that like?
Yeah, it is daunting, to be honest. And another point of comparison here. So if you understand the business model of hospitality, which has certainly been around for thousands of years, it's pretty simple at its core. It gets more complex when you think about the different channels of ownership and how the economics flow accordingly. But then something like what we do in energy, creating the mechanism, the machines, the systems that allow oil and gas, let's say, to be extracted from the seafloor. sounds simple enough, but in practical reality is extraordinarily complex. And I have no engineering background other than to say I appreciate how enormously challenging that is. But then when you break that apart into the different components and the different businesses and the different commercial drivers, why different challenges drive cash flows as one example, it is a huge amount to learn. Absolutely. And as for the 2.5 years, I feel like there's plenty for me to learn still. It is, but at some point you have to also be comfortable without perfect knowledge of a situation.
Yeah.
And I am perfectly comfortable acknowledging that I don't know as much as most of my colleagues do about our business. And that's just the reality of it. But yet I have to rely on them, the partnership, and ask questions. I'm hopefully not afraid to ask questions when I don't understand something that I need to understand.
Yeah.
And perfectly comfortable doing so. And likewise, if I'm speaking with someone who knows our business inside and out, but yet doesn't have that kind of treasury mindset, similarly, want to make sure that they're comfortable psychologically asking questions as well. And I think that's been really the tremendous partnership that I've seen within TechnipFMC, is that a willingness to ask questions and to challenge what we're doing and to engage in that dialogue.
And where do you see it going from here? Where's again, in your notes, you've already said the next legs of your transformation, but with what goal in mind? Where do you see, it sounds like you've come in with, you've had this wealth of treasury expertise before. What's your definition of the perfect treasury? What's happening next for you guys? Again, you're on the AFP committee and things. What are the things that worry you, but you're thinking, right, I need to keep an eye on this, or we need to be focused on this. What's coming next?
Yeah. So we're under various transformations as a company in finance and treasury. And a lot of that just stems from within the finance organization, getting to the level of alignment post-merger, which was already several years ago, that we need to get to, but also taking that step further and just getting to the level of modernization and efficiency that we can get to. And so acknowledging that has been a key step. And that's been driven by our CFO in setting goals as a one finance organization and establishing very specific targets for the types of operational efficiency we want to achieve and the types of financial performance we want to achieve. And so it's within that framework that our CFO has set out. It makes my job a lot easier in expanding that in treasury. And so within treasury, there are multiple dimensions of transformation that we're going through.
I was just like, grab some water if you need it, because I don't really want to.
So one of which is revamping our foreign exchange program and policy. We do a heck of a lot of FX hedging because our supply chain is very global and we do very long run projects. And so that's a complex set of FX risks to manage. Beyond that is in managing our global liquidity. I mentioned getting all of our cash organized so that we can be more mindful about managing our debt is another huge priority. And then getting a global perspective on our credit needs, our trade finance needs. So these are all credit, currency, cash flow, are effectively the lifebloods of our business, of any business, and getting the right tools in place, which means not only policy tools, but system tools as well. And so we're going through a treasury system implementation at the same time. So all of that is kind of the infrastructure to drive our transformation. But at the same time, the transformation, of course, is led and affected and done by people. And so there's an organizational aspect to that transformation too, which means getting the right leaders in place to drive the right types of change. And on that front, so one of the remarkable experiences I've had at TechnipFMC, which is something I never would have thought I'd say as a career-long treasury person, but a majority of my direct reports today actually had no prior experience in treasury before I hired them into their roles, and at senior levels as well. And that might sound shocking to a lot of folks. It was shocking to me before I really did it, but it builds on a theme that I've been observing really through my career, even before TechnipFMC, which is there's a tremendous opportunity out there. I mean, Treasury is such an incredibly siloed place, which is great. You got lots of smart people that are really good at what they do. It does mean sometimes you've got a silo mentality and a bit of a cultural inbreeding, if I can use that term. And that means that unfortunately, Treasury in general, many companies, not always as effective as they can be in partnering with the business and understanding the business. I myself am a product of that environment, and I'm trying to overcome that. But so what I've found a lot of success in is bringing in people from outside of Treasury. And let's be honest, as complex as Treasury is, there's nothing that can't be taught to someone of reasonable intellect and reasonable intellectual curiosity. And bringing in people with the right attitude and aptitude and intellect who understand the business in different ways and who can learn Treasury and want to learn Treasury. And that to me has been tremendously successful in the organization we've created to drive this transformation. As one example, and I've got various folks coming from different sides of the company, one of whom is coming in with a background in various things, one of which is operations, and really brings firsthand knowledge of industrialization. So lean methodology and all of that great stuff that drives a systemized way to change. And as much as I know about Treasury, this guy knows as much, if not more, about industrialization. And so it's been a really fruitful partnership on how to affect change in a meaningful way for the Treasury.
And you gave great takeaways before, but we're going to not take too much of your time. You're a busy man. What are the takeaways maybe you reflected in this new role, or what are as we wrap up, we'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes so people can connect to you. And I know that we'll see you at various conferences and other things, but what are the takeaways you'd share with the audience today, would you say?
The one thing that is always essential in any role in Treasury is to ensure that the methods, the goals, that what Treasury is doing is aligned with the needs of the company. As you noted as well before, companies have different needs. And while I've said in my past that the principles of Treasury are unchanging, which is true, the circumstances of the companies differ. And they sometimes differ during the course of your own role, which I've seen myself a couple of times. So making sure that you're aligned with what your boss, the CFO needs, and his boss, the CEO needs, or her boss, is absolutely essential. The other point, though, is ensuring that alignment is understood and embraced throughout the organization, and driving the importance of culture is absolutely essential. And as often said, is probably even more essential than talent, because a well-oiled group of people, it sounds like a terrible analogy, but a well-organized machine of individuals can do a lot better than a bunch of individual talents can do. And seeing that, and I have seen the benefits of what we're doing at TechnipFMC along those lines too.
Well, I've talked a lot. Just go back to that, and I'll let you carry. But that analogy where it's the sum of the parts, isn't it? It's greater than the whole, and that's incredible. But sorry, go on back to you.
Yeah, right. And I mean, very self-evident, but when you've been around enough to see kind of successes and failures, it becomes apparent. And the last piece is it's getting the alignment with leadership on the company, getting the alignment with the population, with the team broadly. But then it's not that difficult to actually implement a policy or implement a system or implement change, whatever it is. Doing that in a methodical way, in a repeatable way, is a skill unto itself. And I won't claim that I have that skill embedded in me, but I recognize it, and I know how to find people who can do that. And that's the whole industrialization of why that's what makes that possible. And that's something that I will say, I've learned different things from each of the companies that I've worked for. Hilton, for example, fantastic on communication, really knows how to talk to people, which is part of their DNA. TechnipFMC, engineering company, really understands industrialization. And that's kind of a skill set that I've really benefited from learning in my time here.
Thank you very much for a lovely way to end my day. I mean, a lovely chat to Fred, catching up with this new role. And as I say, looking forward to seeing you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mike.
Hello, Treasury professionals. Before you dive into the next episode, could you please help me continue to grow the world's only global Treasury salary survey. That's right, our one. We run the results quarterly, so you know your compensation is constantly benchmarked against the market and your peer group each and every 3 months. It's amazing, isn't it? Just go to treasurysalary.com. It takes less than 2 minutes to complete, start to finish. You then gain exclusive, regular, updated access to our salary survey, keeping you ahead of the curve. The survey is an evolving, breathing entity that constantly tracks the salaries of Treasury professionals on a global basis. Currently, we have over 1,100 participants taking part. By the end of 2023, I want to hit 1,500, but that's where I need your help. Please make it happen at treasurysalary.com. Thank you for being such amazing, loyal listeners. Your support is incredible. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Go to treasurysalary.com. Make it 1,500 for 2023. Love you guys.